everyone, it's Mims. How are you? I hope you're doing well. It is a beautiful afternoon. You might have just seen Jupiter. I don't have much longer with him, so I'm going to show him when I can. Jupiter, what are you doing? There's Jupiter. Anyway, I thought today would be a fun video to make because I found what some people call unicorn, and I just heard a term, a white whale deck, and I like both of those terms. Now, I'm out on the patio. It's one of the last warm days of fall, and so I just thought I would enjoy it, but we may hear some background noise. Right now it's mostly quiet. There is a hum of, I think, an airplane, but just know that there may be some noise popping up. I also am going to open up a can of seltzer, and let's talk about white wave, or not white wave. I think that's tofu. Unicorn and white whale decks. For the longest time, and I'll put this in here because I think for everybody it's a little bit different. For the longest time, I did not connect tarot with social media. I started reading tarot, 10 years ago. And I think for a lot of people, I bought decks in bookstores or in metaphysical shops and just had not made that leap. So I've only been watching TarotTube like 2+ years, and I've had a tarot channel for a little over a year, with videos dating back to May of this year. I deleted some of my older videos. Anyway, with all of that, one of the things that I realized was what was kind of cool about connecting to tarot online was that you find all these decks that you didn't know about. And I tend to like to, if I can, shop in a brick and mortar place. I like to see books on the shelves. I like to see tarot decks on the shelves and look at them. Now, not always. I have learned to embrace some online shopping, particularly when I can support an independent business and so forth. And I love to buy. I had found used decks, and I had been doing that for a while. Getting some decks on Mercari and eBay and things like that. But it was more recently, like I said, in the last couple of years of shopping online and or even knowing about decks. If anyone is interested, I will link to it below because I talked about it kind of as a way of thinking about my 10 years of reading tarot. I went back in memory lane and kind of talked about buying my first deck. And in my first year or two of tarot, reading tarot, I moved in the very first year, which is probably was some of the impetus for buying a deck. And I started seeing a tarot reader. I would go to her probably, and I had a lot of I was definitely at a crossroads in a lot of ways, in terms of career, in terms of a romantic relationship, in terms of not just a career but also jobs. I was in a lot of transition, and so it makes sense to me in going forward that once I started reading tarot, that it also made sense that I was going to a tarot reader probably it wasn't a regular, but fairly regular. I would say I probably once in a while I would go to her once a month, but a lot of the time I was going to her every 2 or 3 months over the course of a couple of years. At the same time, I was learning tarot, reading for myself with a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And one of the things that I loved about going to this particular tarot reader, and as far as I know, she's no longer alive or I don't think she's alive, and she's not practicing because I've looked her up, and we lost touch probably a year or two before the pandemic. Anyway, she read with this deck that I could not even comprehend. And it took me a long time to even figure out what it was. But that was also one of the lovely things about going to see her when I was very much in the midst of that first year or two, which was very much about like learning the tarot and so forth, is I would go to her and I could not recognize the cards, which I think also freed me up to just listening to her instead of me like looking and trying to analyze the cards and so forth. So there was something kind of cool about that. Anyway, I remember Googling, couldn't figure it out. I remember going to a metaphysical shop, couldn't figure it out. And I even remember asking her, and she said, oh, I don't know, I've had this deck forever. Anyway, it was called the Brotherhood of Light Egyptian Tarot. And she had a black and white one. Well, I remember, so well even before I ever found like TarotTube or was going online to look for, I remember like Googling trying to find this tarot deck. Black and white Egyptian tarot, and I would come up with a couple, but it's long been out of print, and it would pop up at like the way those long out of print decks do in like a $200. One time I saw it for $600, and I remember thinking, well, forget that, doesn't matter, I don't care about it that much. Later on then, and this is going to be a caveat. So if for some reason you love the deck that I'm going to show, I have two good options for you. One is there is a color version of this deck that's still in print by US Games. I will put a link to it, not because it's an affiliate link, but if you just are somehow like, oh, this is a deck I'm interested in. And it's nice to have a couple of alternatives. The other one is a reprint that somebody had made on Printer Studio. And this deck has been on my wish list for a while. Sometime last summer, the summer of 24, I found it kind of by accident. I think it was like even like a link to it in Reddit or something where I lurk. I don't even have an account. It doesn't matter. But anyway, I found that someone had made a reproduction of this deck, or facsimile, whichever. And I know those words are not completely interchangeable, but they had made this deck available on Printer Studio, and it's fairly affordable. Well, I just had kind of procrastinated, and then I remember thinking, you know what, that's been in like your wish list for a long, long time, like longer than any other deck that you have. And I had put together a little bit of money, and I was gonna buy it. Well, about a year ago, I also came across this tarot shop called Tarot Garden. They're in West Des Moines, Iowa. And they have, and I know there's other tarot shops out there that do kind of the same thing, but they do what I think is a lovely combo of, they sell mass market decks at mass market prices, like new stuff. They also sell independent decks, and they also sell used and collectible decks. And it's also fun to just noodle around on their pages, because even if it's a deck that's out of stock, they usually will have something kind of interesting about it just in their description. So they keep a lot of decks up. It can make it a little frustrating to look for things, because sometimes a deck will be listed, but it's not until you look at it that you see that it's not available. But if there is a deck that you're interested in, you can get like an email alert, and if it pops up in their inventory, you'll get an email. Well, that's not how I found this unicorn or white whale deck. I just, every once in a while, not even when I'm planning on buying anything, I just like to look at what they have. And it's fun to click around, because you can click around by, you can look by creator, you can look by publisher, and they have lots and lots of used you know, mass market decks, but they also have a lot of collectible decks. Whether like super rare, they had some Italian, I think it was an Italian deck. It was like 15,000 listed on their thing. But they also have like a $5 collectible deck. So they just have a lot of everything. And I think they have really good prices, both for their collectibles as well as their just used decks. So I was noodling around, and I like to click on the collectible section. So you can click and like shop all, or you can look at like bargain pre-owned or the collectible section. So sometimes I'll just look at the collectible section, and I just did it. I think I did it like A to Z. No, I think I just did it like by price, and I think I started highest to lowest, because I think it's always fun to just see like what is a $600 deck, you know, like what's, anyway. So I found, and so I was going through, and I was not planning on buying anything. I just wanted to noodle around because, like I said, it's fun to look at their shop, and they often have little bits of trivia about a deck. They might say things like, there was a deck, in fact, that I have, and I don't remember why, but I looked it up, and they even showed like, oh yeah, this was in an episode of Coronation Street, which I've never seen, but I thought that was a fun little piece of trivia about this particular deck that I have. And again, I can't remember why I looked it up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Oh, I think it was because I was looking up like creator. Let's get into the deck, because that's a long time for me talking. But I also just wanted to talk about the fun of finding that unicorn or that white whale deck. And at the same time, I have started to let go of the idea of those unicorn decks. For one, this is the last one that I have. There's a couple of decks that are on my wish list that I'm like, tariffs and other things, you know, make it harder to make orders. And so I also realized that as many decks that might go out of print, just because it's on sale on eBay for an amount doesn't always mean that it's going to get sold for that amount. So, you know, but I think there was something to, I just don't care. Great example. Now I know that this isn't always going to happen either. Sometimes a creator will like, okay, I'm going to sell the rest of my decks, and I'm no longer going to be publishing or printing or whatever. I get that. I also have come across decks that I was very disappointed because I didn't even know about their existence until they had gone out of indie print, only then to be pleasantly surprised that they were then going into a mass market option. That's happened to me for a couple of decks. The Desert Illuminations deck was one that I only had found out about after the indie run had gone, and I didn't know about the mass market. So when I saw the mass market one, I was very excited. And then another one was the Happy Halloween Tarot. That was one that it had gone out of print, and I remember thinking like, darn, that's a cute deck. And then it went mass market. Now, those are two examples where it wasn't really a white whale deck because I hadn't even known about its existence for very long. But every once in a while, that will happen. You know, a long indie darling will become a mass market. Or every once in a while, you may find the deck that you're just loving. And I happen to. So, and this looks exactly like the packet that my tarot reader used to have. So the Brotherhood of Light, this was first published, I think, in the 30s. And yeah, copyright 1936. This one's renewed 1964. These tarot cards are not playing cards, but the primitive symbolic pictograph writing through which Egyptian initiates conveyed spiritual conceptions derived from a still more remote past. Now, it's funny also because 450, 1969. And so, anyway, if you're ever looking for one of those white whale decks, I would highly consider Tarot Garden. I will put their info below. I'm not an affiliate. There's no whatever. But you might just be interested. And it's also just fun to noodle around in their shop. And if you don't have a metaphysical shop near you in the US, this could be one where if you want even to buy like mass market kinds of things. So we are going to flip through the cards. My neighbor is out, so I'm hoping that I could just do this without her looking. Anyway, so those are the backs. The Printer Studio version of this deck has different backs. I think they have like a purple one and then like a mauve, but the fronts look the same. These are slightly smaller than a typical tarot size. But yeah, so you might be able to tell why I never could tell what they were. They don't have the traditional, names on them, but they do have, like here you've got the High Priestess and you have the Magician. Let's look at the, oh yeah, see, and it has the Fool for 22. And it did say this in the description, the Fool card had a slight stain, but it's not super obvious like in the shuffling. The cards otherwise look in perfect condition, so let's just go through them. So like I said, there are two alternatives, and I had been meaning to buy the US Games version of this deck, but it just didn't have the same mysterious quality, and so I had not done so. Waiting for the neighbor to go by. And this was just a very happy accident, coincidence, or synchronicity. I like to think about synchronicity. But I was absolutely thrilled, but maybe also because once I had found the Printer Studio version, I remember thinking, that's all I care about. Like it wasn't so much like, ooh, I need to have an actual old copy, although this does feel quite lovely. But I remember once I found that Printer Studio copy, I thought that was neat. And I love that people are doing that, particularly things that are long out of print. I think this is now even out of copyright. So, I remember thinking, like, that will be cool. I'll finally make an order for Printer Studio. But that's also a good example. There was another deck that I had wanted to get from Printer Studio. I had saved a couple because I remember thinking, just because of shipping and tax, I remember thinking I'd probably get like a couple of decks. And so there was the Roger Horn something witchcraft deck. It's really cool looking. It's kind of orange with black. I remember when I was thinking about doing an order, I looked and his deck is no longer up there. And then I even went to his website to double check because I thought, well, maybe, and it's just not showing. At least as of the time of me recording this video, that was another deck that I had on my list specifically because it was a Printer Studio deck. And looks like there's a tiny little dot there, but again, these are in really good shape. So in other words, decks go in and out of print, and while there are those white whale decks, there are so many other decks out there that I remember thinking, I'm cool. And maybe because I didn't care that much, and I was also lucky that my white whale deck was still something that I could order, you know, on Printer Studio, or like I said, on, you know, a color version that's still in print from US Games. It definitely looks a little different than this, but at least it's a version thereof. So it wasn't like I was completely without options. But I just felt really lucky about it, about finding it. And then also that I know about the Tarot Garden. I just think they do really great work. You know, curating really neat decks. And they will also buy, if you're an indie creator, I think you have to send them one or send them info, but I know that that's a possibility, that they will sell indie decks from people. And they also will buy, like if you have a large collection or even just a couple of decks that you want to maybe sell, they, I know that that's an option on their page. And I know that there's a few tarot deck shops that will do that. You know, whether you're no longer interested in tarot, or you're just wanting to downsize, or maybe you are wanting to, you know, get rid of some of your rarer older decks for money or other reasons. I am just so thrilled at the happy synchronicity of finding this deck. And like I said, I had seen it at least 10 years ago for like $600. Doesn't mean that it would have sold for that much. That's always the thing with eBay. When you're looking, if there's something you're looking up, just because it's listed for that much doesn't always mean that that's how much it's selling for. And in fact, if you are looking on eBay for out of print decks, look up your deck, like whatever it is, and then look, you can look on the, like where you filter out like location and so forth. You can also look up recently sold prices, and that can give you maybe a better indication of what those prices might go for. But I know that I had seen this deck sometime in the last 10 years, you know, in the hundreds of dollars. And I remember thinking, I don't care if I have that much money, not that interested. And this was well before I knew about the, you know, the US Games color version that's in print, or that Printer Studio. I still wasn't gonna spend that much, and I just don't care. But this felt lovely to find, because it just reminds me of that time of like having lots of questions, learning tarot, and then going to this tarot reader for insight. And you know, this mysterious deck that, sure, I kind of knew the, you know, I knew some of the pips, but sometimes I would just get so lost in her reading that I didn't even bother. And it was a relaxing, one of the many reasons why I enjoyed going to her, because I didn't really recognize most of the symbols. And sitting far away, or, you know, like across the table, the numbers were even, you know, like upside down and not always apparent. And so, yeah, it's bringing memories back. And I just felt really lucky to get this deck. So like I said, it was $600, and I've gotten some other decks from them before, both just some mass market used decks that I wanted, and some things that have been on my wish list. But what they'll do is they'll send you this little, I think that's how they keep track of their inventory, and they'll put, so the title and the price, and the publication status, and then what the condition is. So they're calling mine excellent. I think it's because of that stain and then that one other card. And then they'll also give you an approximate market value if it had been in mint condition. So I got mine for $69. If it had been in mint condition, it might go for $100. That's the other reason that I like them, is because I feel like they're a little more realistic about, like, you know, and if they've bought and sold so many decks, I don't know how long they've been in business, but yeah. So let's just do a 1-card pull. Whoops. Let's see if I recognize all those cards. And there's no guidebook or anything. I don't think it ever had one. But you can, I think, still buy the CS Zain. I think that's his name. CS Zain. I think you can still buy that guidebook, either used or like maybe even as a PDF. So what message do you have for us today? What message do you have for us today? Oh, these feel really good to shuffle. They're just a tiny bit smaller. They feel really good in the hand. And it's a strong cardstock, but smooth. Okay, what message do you have for us today? Those are wands? See? Let's double check that. Coins are obvious, and cups, but sometimes wands and, oh yeah, those are wands. So 7 of Wands. I often think about 7 just in very basic numerology, and again, I'm not going with necessarily Rider-Waite-Smith, so you may have a slightly different interpretation of this card. But 7 feels like this is where you're having to stake your ground. This is where you're having to have, or this is where it's a good point to forget what it looks like right now, because what it looks like on the outside, it might be further along than it appears. And that could be anything from like a garden. I'm thinking about gardens right now because it's outside and it's the end of the year. But this can also be about things that are in that deep set of creation. You may not see the evidence that's there about your near completion or your near success. This is the digging in. This is where you might be having to go beyond the inspiration of wands. And this is where the hard work kicks in. That's what I'm taking this as. If that resonates for you, great. If it doesn't, just leave it behind. But I would love to hear, do you have a white whale or unicorn deck? Have you let go of that thought because you just know, like, you know what, there's plenty of other decks that have come around. I would love to hear what do you have one on your list? Do you have one in your possession of that white whale deck, unicorn deck that you never thought would come around? Did it come around to you? Or are you still looking for it? I would love to hear. I hope you're well. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're finding joy. And I hope you're finding ways to take care of the earth and others in a mutual aid sense. And I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.